Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 91. I've got Kevin Gutzman. He's a professor at Western Connecticut State University. He also calls himself a Jeffersonian. We're going to talk about his study of history, and he's got a book out called The Jeffersonians, which is about Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. How are you doing, Kevin?
All's well. Thank you.
I always like to start out. How did you get into all this?
Oh, well, do you want the topic of the particular book, or do you want my general scholarly focus?
How did you get into your career and how did you become a Jeffersonian?
Oh, okay. Well, as far as the career goes, after graduating as an undergrad, I entered a joint degrees program at the University of Texas Law School and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And one component of that was a summer internship in some public policy organization. So I interned on Capitol Hill in summer of '87. And all my free time, I read about American history, especially constitutional history. So it being '87, the bicentennial of the Constitution, that was in the air. As an undergraduate, I hadn't really cared about that at all. I took the 6 hours of American history courses that were required by the Texas legislature for graduation from any Texas public university. But my main interest was France, and I'd carefully avoided this. However, I found it fascinating. And when I got to law school, I found that there wasn't much relationship between constitutional history up through the founding period and constitutional law in 1987. So I soon decided, well, I'm not really interested in becoming a lawyer, but I went ahead and finished law school. Eventually, I went back to grad school to get a PhD in American history. And the short of it is, for various reasons having to do with which faculty members were available to supervise my project, I ended up writing a dissertation on Virginia in the Revolutionary Era. It's called Virginia's American Revolution. The book is called Virginia's American Revolution. And as far as this current book goes, this is my sixth. The fourth one was about James Madison's constitutional career. It was not a general biography of Madison. It was focused on him as constitution maker. And I had the Pulitzer Prize winning historian Daniel Walker Howe write a cover blurb for that book. When he gave me the blurb, he said, "I quite liked your book, but I wish you had devoted more attention to Madison as president. There's not really a lot of good scholarship on his presidency." And so when I finished my immediate preceding book, which was about Jefferson's political program, it's called Thomas Jefferson Revolutionary, and I was kind of casting about for a next project, I thought, well, what about that idea of Madison's presidency? And I soon realized, after doing some kind of background reading on that topic, you couldn't really write about Madison's presidency without talking about Jefferson's presidency. And similarly, it turned out, you couldn't really talk about Madison as a kind of finished product either, because Monroe, who was at one point both Secretary of War and Secretary of State under Madison at the same time, succeeded him. Like the two of his predecessors, followed the same program. And fortunately, or oddly, or maybe both, there wasn't another book on this subject. There's not another book on this question of the three early 19th century Virginia Republican presidencies, even though all three of them understood it as essentially one continuous administration. They all had essentially the same program, which was laid out by Jefferson in his poetic first inaugural address in 1801. And so that's where I ended up with this project.
Yeah, it sounds like a great project. I mean, obviously they all knew each other well, and we had three. George Washington was the first, and then we had Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. The third, fourth, and fifth presidents were all from Virginia.
Right. Well, that was partly because Virginia was by far the most populous state. It was the most extensive. It was the oldest. It was the wealthiest. It provided a disproportionate share of leadership in the Revolution. It provided a disproportionate share of leadership in writing the Constitution. It just was central to American political life in a way that we really can't quite recapture today.
Yeah, definitely the case. I remember, the Hartford Convention. That was one of their protests, is they wanted to have presidents from other states.
Yes.
It was.
Well, so at the end of the War of 1812, in case people don't know what you're talking about, Massachusetts legislature called for a meeting of delegates from the New England states at Hartford. This is during the War of 1812. And what had been going on was that New England governments were opposing the war effort. In fact, by the time the Hartford Convention was held, if you were a naval captain in the British Navy and you found yourself short of provisions, you could just go into port in Massachusetts and buy all the stores you wanted, buy all kinds of naval equipment. And the government of Massachusetts was essentially helping the British in this effort. And so anyway, the Massachusetts government called for a meeting of delegates from New England states at Hartford. People had the impression that maybe this was going to be a secession convention. It turned out it was not a secession convention. But what it ended up doing was producing a bunch of proposed amendments to the Constitution. And one of them was there couldn't be successive presidents from the same state. One of them was that presidents would be term limited to one term. There would be no more economic coercion via embargo. Essentially, what they wanted to do was outlaw the Republican Party, more or less, to make its whole program unconstitutional. And unfortunately for them, word of the product of the Hartford Convention got to other parts of America at about the same time as news of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans and news of the concluding treaty that had been reached at Ghent. So that now it seemed the Americans had won the war. They actually had not won the war, but Jackson won the last major battle in the war. And so within a few years, the Federalist Party, which had become more or less a New England party, ceased to exist. So when Monroe was reelected in 1820, he got all but one electoral vote. And the one elector who voted against him was a fellow Republican who just didn't, he said, his personality is not appropriate for this office, right? He just didn't like him. That was all. And so the Federalist Party, which was the party of Washington, Adams, John Marshall, had ceased to exist, except in that it continued to control the Supreme Court for years to come.
Well, as Thomas Bailey wrote, unanimity was only reserved for George Washington.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if that was a factor or not, but it's that was a very interesting period in history, the War of 1812. What do you looking back at? Let's start with Jefferson. What and I've read. I think more libertarians should read Thomas Jefferson. Because I definitely consider him influencing me. Who do you think influenced Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe the most?
Oh boy. Yeah. Well, they were educated differently. Start with Monroe. Monroe was an 18-year-old freshman at the College of William and Mary when the Revolution began in 1776, and he and several of his classmates dropped out of college and went and joined the Continental Army. So Monroe never made up this defect in his upbringing. He never was able to go back to college and get the rest of an education. This made him markedly different from the other two, Jefferson and Madison, each of whom had a very finely honed intellect. Each of them was brilliant. I think it's indisputable that both Jefferson and Madison were of extraordinary intellect. And their educations were markedly different. So, for example, or I should say, starting with Madison, because he was an unhealthy, small, very slight, in fact, still the smallest person ever to be president, fellow, he went off to Princeton, what was then called the College of New Jersey, for college. And the reason was that he thought that Tidewater, Virginia was unhealthy. And so if he went there, he would get sick. And he didn't think he could stand that. So he went off to New Jersey. And at the College of New Jersey at the time, the president of the college was John Witherspoon, who would end up being a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But he was a Presbyterian divine. He was a Scottish minister. And that meant he was a Calvinist. So while in Virginia at the time, the Episcopal Church, which was the established church of colonial Virginia, was under the influence of latitudinarian theological thinkers in England, that is, increasingly liberal approach to Christianity. For Madison to be under the tutelage of a Calvinist meant that he was taught a very skeptical understanding of human psychology. And we can see this reflected in, for example, Federalist Number 10, most famous essay maybe in American political science, in which Madison says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But until we're governed by angels, let ambition counteract ambition. So you see what he has in mind here is that people are corrupt, they're selfish, they want all the money, sex, power, and fame they can get. And rather than try to remedy that, which he thought was impossible, what you had to do was have countervailing powers in the federal system or in any well-wrought government system. And that was not the way Jefferson understood psychology at all. Jefferson was very optimistic about man and the possibility of well-wrought government to elicit from people their better selves. Madison didn't think you could count on anybody's better self. In general, people would align with others of like mind with similar interests. I mean by that economic interests, religious interests, geographical interests, and you'd want to arrange the political system so that no one of them could come to dominate. Jefferson didn't think that was such a problem. So Jefferson was very sympathetic in the early days early years with the French Revolution. And for people like Madison, well, the French Revolution was obviously going to fail in the first place because it was entirely democratic. So when Jefferson was at William and Mary, he went because, unlike Madison, he wasn't of a sickly constitution. He studied under an Englishman named William Small, who brought him up to date with all the current thought of the Enlightenment, which maybe not so much in Scotland, but certainly in its French iteration was very optimistic about trusting the average Joe or Jacques to run his own government. And that meant that Jefferson was optimistic about government. He didn't think, for example, it was so entirely necessary to have countervailing authority in government. For example, what you want to do was to elicit people's opinions and have the government act on those. Madison believed that there was no way to expect, or there was no reason to expect, that there wouldn't be political parties, that men wouldn't divide into factions, that they wouldn't seek their own selfish interests. And rather than try to find some solution to that, Jefferson would say problem, Madison would say reality. Madison's answer was, well, we have to try to find checks and balances so that we don't end up with particular selfish groups forcing their preferences on everyone else. And as I say, Monroe didn't end up studying these kinds of constitutional questions because he dropped out of college to go join the Continental Army, where he became an authentic war hero.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And just to make sure everybody knows, at the time of the American Revolution, most of the colonies had, what was an established church. It was basically a state church,
Right.
Pennsylvania and Rhode Island did not, but I think, and maybe Georgia didn't, but I think all the other ones did. Is that right?
Well, Georgia was, in theory, it was officially Episcopalian. But yeah, actually, the southern colonies had the problem. For example, in North Carolina, which was also officially Episcopalian, there was a period in the late 18th century when there was not a single Episcopal minister in North Carolina, which meant legally nobody could be married, nobody could be baptized, there couldn't be a funeral in theory. Of course, people got around this. What were they going to do with a dead body, right? They had to bury it.
Yeah.
But the point is, or what you could draw from this is that the establishment in North Carolina was very weak. And it happened that the establishment in Virginia was weak too. It wasn't weak because of an absence of ministers. It was weak because it had come to be dominated not by the clerics, but by the ruling class of Virginia, which were the same people as produced, the same group as produced Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Marshall, John Randolph of Roanoke, John Taylor of Caroline, all these other prominent people, people who've been prominent in the Revolution, like Washington, the Lees, Randolphs, various other such.
Yeah, and there was also, a lot of intermarrying and things like that among the Randolphs.
Oh, yes. Yes, in fact, they
Jeffersons.
tended to be related to each other over and over. So, for example, Jefferson, when he became president, he appointed his best friend to be Secretary of State. He took the oath of office from his cousin, the Chief Justice. The House Majority Leader was another cousin of Jefferson's. The Secretary of State's wife had 3 in-laws who were members of the House of Representatives and another relative on the Supreme Court. Just the whole thing was a big network of cousins. In fact, in Virginia, historians refer to the way that their system ran as a kind of cousinocracy. Right? Everybody was related to everybody else. And this was, of course, entirely unlike the way things work now. I'm sitting in Connecticut. Our state legislature does not have anybody who's a prominent, banker in New York City in the state Senate. You would not think to do that if you were a prominent banker in New York City. You wouldn't even run for Congress. But in Virginia, there was a kind of ethic. If you had money, you should be in politics. In fact, at one point in my book, I showed James Monroe writing to a friend of his, another famous political figure from the early 19th century, John Taylor of Caroline. Taylor is of interest to libertarians, of course, because he was very skeptical about government in general. But the reason why Monroe was writing him was to say, look, you have sufficient money. You're a prominent person. Why are you retired from politics? You should be in government. What are you doing? So this man on 3 different occasions was a U.S. senator. But the first 2 times he served for 2 years and then resigned. Right? He served for 2 years and then resigned. So Monroe was saying to him, look, Jefferson, Madison, Marshall, all these people were all in government. That's what you're supposed to do. So there was just a kind of an ethic. You were obliged to be in public service if you could afford it. And John Taylor was soon back in the U.S. Senate. He ended up dying during his 3rd stint in the U.S. Senate. And of course, now we don't expect that. Now we think people stay in the U.S. Senate until they drop dead, right? So it's totally different.
Yeah, there was a lot more turnover back then. I mean, even among some of the, they would sometimes go to different offices or they'd move around. Even, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster were certainly that way. They didn't stay in the same position that long.
Right.
So, so really it's interesting to see how this worked out. How do you think this played out? I mean, Jefferson, of course, is much more associated with the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, while Madison is much more associated with the Federalist Papers and the Constitution. Even though they were all pretty much friends, though, right?
Oh, I think any 2 of them would have been the 2 best friends who've ever been president. So if only 2 of them had been president, that would still be the case. Jefferson and Madison were each other's best friend in the world. Monroe, at one point in the Madison administration, was simultaneously Secretary of War and Secretary of State. And he had been a law student of Jefferson's when he was a young man. So these 3 people were all very closely wrapped. And their political principles, although you find some distinction, they were also extremely close. The one who's less like the other 2 is Madison, but I would say he's obviously still a Jeffersonian too. So in general, what they have in common are the beliefs that are the principles that are laid out by Jefferson in his first inaugural address. And anybody who hasn't read it can easily find it on the internet, right? So Jefferson famously said in his first inaugural address, we've called by different names, brethren of the same principle. We're all Republicans. We're all Federalists. And what he meant there was he didn't believe in parties. By the end of my book, I show that Monroe not believing in parties ended up meaning there weren't any parties. So not only when he was reelected were there no Federalists in the Electoral College, but he was doing nothing to keep the Republican Party going either. And that's why his successor ended up being from Massachusetts. Monroe didn't think there should be another Virginian president. And so he did not push anybody from Virginia to a prime position in his cabinet. He didn't want there to be parties at all. In fact, he said there shouldn't be parties. And in fact, the founder of today's Democratic Party, Martin Van Buren, who was a rising politician at the end of my book and was going to be prominent in the several administrations after that, referred to the idea of not having parties as, quote unquote, the Monroe heresy. But the Monroe heresy was not originally Monroe's idea. When Jefferson said in that first inaugural address, we've called by different names, brethren, the same principle, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. What he meant was, we all have the same political beliefs. Being an American means you have the same political beliefs. And this party distinction we've labored under has been artificial. So Jefferson believed that what had happened was in the 1790s, because George Washington had just a special place in Americans' hearts, and because Alexander Hamilton somehow inexplicably had maneuvered his way into Washington's confidence, Americans' federal government had ended up with a program that was inconsistent with the Revolution. But now the election victory of the Republicans in 1800 and 1801 meant this temporary phenomenon was past, and we could get back to a situation in which essentially we all agreed about everything important. And that's what he thought would happen. And more or less by the end of my book, that's what did happen.
Well, Jefferson, wrote, I believe, the federalism of '99 differed but in name from the Toryism of '76 or something like that.
Yeah, so that's what he thought. Right, that's what he thought.
I don't know how true that was, but that was what Jefferson, because it's very interesting because Jefferson absolutely despised Hamilton, as far as I know. Although Madison was a little friendlier to him.
Well, actually, Madison, in his retirement, was frequently asked for information about his political career and about political events in which he'd been involved, and he did defend Hamilton. He didn't defend his program, which of course he had led the way in arguing was unconstitutional. Madison was the one, for example, who invented the argument that the bank bill was unconstitutional in 1791. But he also insisted that there had been no personal corruption in Hamilton. He had not taken money from the federal government. He had not done any of the things that some people insinuated that he had done, which was true. He had not done those things. So Madison knew Hamilton. Madison was careful not to take credit for essays in the Federalist that Hamilton had written, right? So he, I think, was fair to Hamilton in retrospect.
You don't think Jefferson was fair to Hamilton?
I think Jefferson was prone to Manichaeanism. That is, he thought there were kind of good people and evil people. And I think that Hamilton had different political principles from Jefferson, but he was not personally corrupt. He was not unpatriotic. Obviously, I tend to be more sympathetic with the Jeffersonian program, but another example of Jefferson's doing this is that when the first biographer of Patrick Henry was working on that book, he contacted Jefferson for information about him, and Jefferson sent him a long memorandum about Henry that was just entirely negative. And the fellow more or less relayed Jefferson's whole account of Henry, which now essentially all historians see as having been woefully distorted, right? It was completely unfair to Henry because he and Jefferson had a personal falling out. So one has to be careful in treating Jefferson's personal evaluations of his political opponents. They tend to go beyond disagreement in principle, I'd say.
Yeah. Do you think that might have been? I know Patrick Henry still favored a state-established church. Do you think that might have been why he didn't get along with Jefferson, or was it maybe something more personal?
I don't know that I don't know after the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was adopted that Henry ever did anything along that line. He had opposed the general idea of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. He would have required that. Actually, his proposal was that people should be required to choose the religious congregations of their choice to donate money to, So this was called a general assessment. And Madison in the legislature said that his alternative was Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom, which did not require anything like that. So it's true that Henry wanted to continue having the state require people to be members of local religious congregations, but it's not true that he wanted them to have to be Episcopalian even if they weren't, which had been the situation, of course, during the colonial period.
Not to mention, Patrick Henry is also one of the most vocal, I think probably the most vocal anti-federalist. I mean, he was against the Constitution.
He was against the Constitution in the Virginia Ratification Convention. However, once it was adopted, he no longer was against it. In fact, they had a meeting of anti-federalist delegates the night that the Virginia Ratification Convention voted to ratify the Constitution. And apparently George Mason, who had been one of the other leading anti-federalists in the Virginia Ratification Convention, stood up and made some speech in which he basically said, we need to figure out how we're going to oppose this. And Henry countered, no, we've lost. We lost fair and square. This is a Republican society. When you lose a vote, you have to accommodate it. You don't continue to oppose it. So he was going to try to live with it. And he said we should ensure that they implement this as they have described it to us, which he was skeptical of, but he was not an ongoing opponent of the federal government. In fact, he ended up, there's a recent book by a fellow who works at Monticello, John Ragosta, I believe his name is pronounced, about Henry, in which he takes up Henry's last couple of years of life. Washington persuaded Henry to come out of political retirement because Washington, who by this time, of course, is the ex-president, thought that the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were a threat to the existence of the federal union. And Henry was back to this position I just described in 1788. He had said, look, I oppose the Constitution. I obviously opposed ratifying it, but it's been ratified now, and we have to try to see that it's implemented as they promised us it would be. So he opposed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think this is not inconsistent, though. Again, he believed you make a good argument. If you lose the vote, well, in a Republican society, that means you have to accommodate it.
Yeah, that's not true. There was a story. I wonder if you say Jefferson was a little maybe exaggerated, but he told a story about how Jefferson had these pictures of John Milton, John Locke, and Francis Bacon, and Alexander Hamilton asked who they were, and
Newton, Locke and Bacon.
Newton, Locke and Bacon, yes,
right.
Yes, Newton, Locke and Bacon, yes, yeah. And Hamilton asked who they were, and Jefferson said it was a tribute to the three greatest men who ever lived, and Hamilton responded, the greatest man who ever lived was Julius Caesar. I mean, doesn't that kind of sum up a political philosophy there, right there?
Well, there are different ways you can read this. Assuming this story is entirely true, which, maybe it's a cartoon, but he did say that, you're right. There are different ways to understand it. One is maybe Hamilton said that and meant it. One is maybe he knew that Jefferson was really touchy and he was saying it to annoy him. I think Hamilton had a bit of the imp in him. So it could be that he was doing that, but it could be that it could also be that he was making a point. And we do know that he did take the name Caesar when writing for the public, just as later, of course, he took the name Publius when writing for the public. So who knows? I don't know how to read that. I do know that he wanted a Republican government in the United States. There's no doubt about that. So,
yeah. Who were some of their other influences? I mean, Jefferson was obviously a big fan of John Locke and Algernon Sidney, but who were some other influences that you found on these men? I mean, well, also maybe John Milton and maybe some others.
Well, okay. So for Madison, David Hume, certainly.
Yeah.
David Hume, I mentioned before, Witherspoon at Princeton, which was then called the College of New Jersey, being a Calvinist meant he was skeptical about humans. He thought you should be skeptical about other people's characters. And of course, David Hume was an atheist, Scot, also a very fine writer. He too was very skeptical about humans. So this reading Hume when he was at Princeton would have reinforced this message that he was getting from Minister Witherspoon. And besides that, the two of them, Jefferson and Madison, they had read all the major figures in French, Latin, Greek, philosophy, and history, and you would get the same kind of message from Cicero as you would get from Hume or Locke or any of these people. So I do think, though, that the difference in cast of mind is that Jefferson was more hopeful. He was in on the ground floor at the beginning of the French Revolution and thought that there was no way that it could go too far. There was no way that democratic reform could become too democratic. There was no reason to have one's optimism about humanity be limited. And this was entirely contrary to the way that Madison understood politics, because he understood psychology differently. And of course, we can't prove it, but I have to think this is because of the influence of Witherspoon and Hume on him. So that's the main difference between the two of them. And it's a significant difference. If you spend much time with Madison at all, you're going to see what I'm talking about. Even if you just read the Federalist, but if you read other things he wrote too, you see that he thought there had to be what we would now call checks and balances, that you had to let ambition counteract ambition. You couldn't expect just to elect a poobah and to have him run your society well, because he would favor himself and his friends. And for Jefferson, well, if you let the people speak, the people are going to know what the people want. And so why not trust the people? There was actually a kind of vogue among the first American state constitution writers for unicameralism. And both John Adams and Madison thought unicameralism was a terrible idea. You end up with a unicameral legislature in Pennsylvania, and you get, what kind of legislation do you get? Well, you can kind of imagine. And the fear that people like Madison had was that if you had unicameralism, you'd have a lot of say for people who were not among the property class, and they would want the legislature to reapportion property. And this was to be lamented. This was awful. But Jefferson, hearing of Shays' rebellion, was positive about it. He was in France at the time, and he saw what he said was a situation in which there were a few wolves and most of the French were sheep. So in other words, to be a nobleman or a bishop or a visiting diplomat in Paris was very heaven. But to be anyone else was just awful. You were in grinding poverty. So he wanted those kind of extreme measures for France that Madison's entire political science was designed to prevent from coming to be in the United States. So you might think, well, then how did the two of them ended up being the two leaders of this party movement? And the answer is because they're both skeptical of the Federalists. And of course, there were people who were actual monarchists in their political science among the leading Federalists. There were people who thought, as Hamilton said, the best government in the world is the British government. So ideally, we'd have a government like the British government. Well, the only problem was there were no people in America who were in a financial, or who were in a social position to be kings and lords. So you couldn't just create them. So you couldn't have something like the British government anyway. But anyway, both Jefferson and Madison then favored republicanism in all of America's political institutions in a way that Federalists in general either didn't or weren't really that concerned about. And it seems that Monroe agreed with these principles too. I mean, so did Albert Gallatin and Calhoun and other prominent people in the Republican Party during the period my book is about.
Yeah. Well, they did not have very many models at the time to learn from. I mean, they could study English history, and they could, and of course, they all were aware of the history of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But what else did they have to use as a what else did they have to use as a as a template?
Well, people in Europe in general in the 18th century thought the British had the best constitution.
Yeah.
So several prominent Enlightenment figures from other countries wrote about the British Constitution. And at one point, apparently, Catherine the Great, the Russian empress, said, well, if she weren't the empress, she'd want something like the British Constitution. So apparently she had good self-awareness. But anyway, so something like this, and essentially we already mentioned the exception of the first Pennsylvania Constitution, but something like, in its broad outlines, like the British Constitution, is what were created in the different American states. So you end up with 3-branch governments with an independent executive and bicameralism in virtually all the states. And so where did they get this idea? Well, partly from their own colonial experience, but partly from their understanding that Britain had the best constitution that was in existence at the time. We wanted to have ours be a Republican, but it should in general look like the British one. And of course, all the state constitutions ended up looking kind of like the British one. And today, Vermont and Nebraska have significantly different state constitutions, but in general, the state constitutions today are all pretty similar, and they're obviously descended from the British example, just as the federal one is.
Yeah, definitely. And so at the time also, who was voting during this time? It was
well, that depends what state.
Property men, right? I mean,
well, it depends what state you're in.
Yeah.
So if you were I'm sitting in Connecticut. If you were in Connecticut, you had to be an adult male of sound mind who was a member of the local Congregationalist community. And that was true also in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire. So there were in Virginia, on the other hand, you had to have significant property holding. You had to own either a certain number of acres in the countryside or a lot in one of the legislatively designated towns. There are only 2 of those. And we think probably about half of adult white men of sound mind were excluded from voting in Virginia because of this. So in other words, the New England states were extremely democratic. The only places more democratic in the whole world were a couple of cantons in Switzerland. In England, for example, people who were eligible to vote for members of the House of Commons numbered only about 10% of the adult male population of sound mind, right? So that was very democratic in Europe. In Spain, nobody voted. In France, nobody voted. In Russia, nobody voted. In Turkey, nobody voted. In England, 10% of the commoners got to vote. So that was very democratic. But in America, essentially, all the colonies were more democratic than that, and some in New England were extremely democratic for those days. And people had the idea that the new state constitutions ought to be democratic. In the Constitutional Convention, on the other hand, in Philadelphia, there was talk about this. And at one point, I believe it was Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts said, "We have suffered from an excess of democracy." So I'm quoting here. So they had the idea that, well, we don't want, or at least some people had the idea, well, we don't want everybody to vote, but they couldn't agree on that. And that's why the Constitution left this question to the states for their own decision. So the Constitution doesn't say in state elections, every adult male citizen of sound mind gets to vote or something like that. It just leaves it up to state determination. And it was very, very different from state to state.
Yes, and Vermont, although Vermont was not an original colony, Vermont, I believe, when they came into the Union, that was the first state that had manhood suffrage.
Universal manhood suffrage. And then the first state that had universal white male suffrage was South Carolina, which in the state legislature, it was John Calhoun who wrote that law. So actually Vermont, I'm trying to think of the dates. It may be that Carolina had that before Vermont was officially a state. People may not be familiar with this, but Vermont was actually originally part of New York. And so the government of New York did not agree that Vermont was a state. They thought of it as a kind of secessionist region in their own state. And that meant Congress didn't recognize Vermont as a state for a while too. I think South Carolina had white male suffrage before Vermont was recognized as a state by other states. So how you want to weigh the primacy claims of those two states is up to you.
That's very interesting, especially considering that those two states have went in their many cases very opposite directions.
Yes, they did.
And
it's interesting that Calhoun wrote the first white male suffrage law in the world, apparently. Yeah.
Well, I think also about, more recent things like the Second Vermont Republic,
right,
which is a secessionist movement. Then you think about South Carolina and all their secessionist movements.
Yes.
It's, which are in many cases the exact opposite. It's very interesting. So it is, I do want to ask, what do you think was the cause and what do you think they really wanted when Shays' Rebellion happened? What did the rebels want?
Well, apparently, what had happened was that when the revolution ended, every state had significant debt. And Massachusetts, under the control of Puritanism, decided, we're going immediately to pay off our debt. And what they did was they jacked up prices. They jacked up taxes substantially. And then they also passed a law that said you had to pay them in coin. And what this meant was that people who lived in Western Massachusetts, where unlike in Boston and surrounding area, you weren't going to see coin that often, they weren't going to have money to pay their taxes. So they argued against this in the legislature. And then when it passed, there ended up being this tax revolt in the Western counties. And it was not because people in the Western counties didn't want to pay taxes. It was because they couldn't, because the state legislature was requiring to be paid in coin. So essentially what Shays' Rebellion was about was closing down courthouses to keep people's farms from being foreclosed on due to their inability to pay their state taxes. And eventually the government of Massachusetts slacken these rules so that they wouldn't have this problem. But in the first place, it had been essentially because people in the East just didn't realize what the economic conditions were in the western part of the state. So that's what the rebellion was about. It was not because people were unhappy with the new structure of the government or because they didn't like some policy that had been adopted. It was because of this tax impracticability that had been imposed on them by out-of-touch coastal legislators in Boston.
And obviously at the time you had much more population in the East than in the West.
Yes, well, it's true even now, but yeah, more then than now. There was essentially nobody living in the West. It was where people had moved because the East was fully populated. In those days, since overwhelmingly Americans were farmers, people would want to live on the coast where they could easily export their farm produce. And then as their families filled the coastal lands, there was migration to the West for new farmland, as no doubt you're aware. But anyway, that factor helps to explain why the Jeffersonians came to dominate American politics so completely by the end of the period my book covers. The Louisiana Purchase meant that if formerly you, and say I'm sitting in Connecticut, if you with your wife and 10 kids, half of whom were male, had realized, well, when our boys are grown up, we're not going to be able to give them farmland because we don't have any. Now there was going to be this gigantic empire of land that was available to American citizens for a song, thanks to Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Basically, all three of them were involved in buying Louisiana. And so, geez, how can we complain about this? They got rid of all the internal taxes and they're providing land virtually for free. Who needs the Federalists? Even by the time the book comes to an end, even Connecticut, which was one of 3 states that voted against Jefferson all 3 times he was a presidential candidate. No, 2 states that voted against him all 3 times he was a presidential candidate. Even Connecticut was voting Republican, because why wouldn't you? There was just no reason not to.
Yes, and of course, there's also that, some people would just go west because they wanted to start a new life.
Right.
Maybe they committed a crime, but nobody realized they committed a crime, so it was just a way to get out of town and go start over. You could
maybe
start off with a clean slate. Because nobody would know who you were, and it's very interesting. So, do you think Shays' Rebellion had a lot of influence on the Constitution being passed?
Well, we know that there are provisions of the Constitution that are about Shays' Rebellion. So one is that the federal government was empowered by the Constitution to ensure that every state has Republican government. And what that meant was to put down rebellions within states against their state governments. This gets to the fact, or this reminds me of the fact that when he heard of Shays' Rebellion, Sam Adams, who had been the chief tax resister in the 13 colonies, was totally unsympathetic, right? And his response was that it could not be legitimate to resist taxes imposed by a Republican government, as Americans had resisted the monarchists' attempts to impose taxes in the 1760s and 70s. So Sam Adams thought that Shays' rebels ought to be punished. And actually, people like that should be punished in the future. And this is why the Constitution ended up including this provision that the federal government could, quote, ensure that each state had a Republican government. And of course, we end up seeing that President Washington leads an army out against the whiskey rebels personally while president, got on his white horse and led armed forces out toward Western Pennsylvania to do what? To enforce the tax laws. Same kind of scenario as had happened in Massachusetts when Shays was up in arms.
Definitely. So, it's interesting. You talk about Jefferson's republicanism. How do you think that ended up playing out? Because, I remember Andrew Jackson said that Jefferson was the best Republican in theory and the worst in practice.
Well, Jefferson thought Andrew Jackson was a threat to the Republic.
So, he did not like Andrew Jackson at all.
Yeah, and actually, in my book, I tell the story of deliberations in the Monroe cabinet over what to do about Jackson's insubordination. So, the War Secretary Calhoun had ordered Jackson not to invade either of the Floridas and take its capital. And so what did Jackson do? He invaded West Florida and took its capital. So then they got word that this had happened, and they debated in the cabinet what to do about it. And of course, War Secretary Calhoun's position was, we need to relieve this guy immediately, right? He has to go. This is, we could say it's incipient Caesarism, right? He just decided, I have an army, why not use it? And John Quincy Adams' response was, well, okay, it's true. We don't want American generals over the order of their civilian superiors going out and starting wars with major European powers. On the other hand, he's already done it. So maybe we could make use of this. And what ended up happening was that Adams' recommendation was they should contact the King of Spain about it. So there came a letter from President Monroe to the King of Spain saying essentially, look, we didn't want our general to invade West Florida. In fact, we told him not to, but he did. And you can see how easy that was. So you might want to think about the question whether you would like us to pay you for Florida. And of course, in parentheses, you can understand that what he was saying was, or not, right? So the King of Spain then sent a message to several of the other major royals in Europe saying, hey, are we going to let the Americans behave this way? And none of them intervened on Spain's side. So the Spanish king ended up selling East and West Florida, that is today's state of Florida, plus the coastal regions of Alabama, Mississippi, and the part of Louisiana that's east of the Mississippi River. Those were all sold to the Monroe administration because Jackson had done this. But the fact that there had been this debate in the cabinet later when Calhoun, the war secretary, ended up being vice president in the Jackson administration, word of this leaked out and Jackson confronted him about it. And that's why Calhoun became the first vice president to resign as vice president, right? So he was, of course, right about this. And in fact, Jackson should have been fired. But on the other hand, it was better to get Spain to sell us the Floridas than it was to fire Jackson. So I think Monroe made the right decision, even though both Calhoun and Adams gave him good advice about it. And actually, that's kind of the story of the Monroe administration. Calhoun and Adams gave him good advice, and he usually took it.
And it's also kind of, it also would, happen again in 1846. We'll invade Mexico and then pay them for the land.
Right.
Take the land, but then pay them for it. Whereas, I guess that's an improvement, sort of. But I know also, Florida is actually a very interesting case because Florida actually was sort of a colony, but they did not rebel against England. They were totally opposed to it.
Right.
In 1776,
actually half the colonies that Britain had in the Western Hemisphere did not join in the American Revolution. And people don't realize there were 26 British colonies in the Western Hemisphere at the time. And one of the island colonies, not Barbados, I'm not thinking which one, but one of them, the Continental Congress sent letters to the other 13 saying, hey, we've declared independence, you should join us. So one of the island colonies wrote back and said, well, okay, we agree with your argument, and we agree that, in future, the British should not tax us without representation. On the other hand, they said, if we declared independence, they would just send the Royal Navy here, and their army would take over our country, and they would free our slaves, and that would be the end of it. So obviously we can't join you, but good luck. That was their position. So it's not that all of them disagreed with the Declaration of Independence. It was just that some of them thought it was impractical. In fact, one of the first two histories of the American Revolution was written by a South Carolinian named Drayton, and who was a significant slave owner. In fact, if you go to Charleston, South Carolina now, one of the main things you ought to go see is a place just outside the city called Drayton Hall, which is an old plantation house. It's spectacular. It could be some British lord's house. Anyway, Drayton wrote a history of the American Revolution, and he said, if it had not been for migration into upcountry South Carolina in the couple of decades before the Revolution started, that is, if people in Western Pennsylvania and Virginia and New York had not been moving south to upcountry South Carolina in the last 20 years before the Revolution, we wouldn't have been able to join them because the population ratio in South Carolina 50 years before the Revolution was 2 blacks for every white person. And by the time the Revolution started, it was 50-50. So his point was essentially they would have been in the same position as that island colony was in, which was, we couldn't have done it because they would have just said, okay, your slaves are all freed. And then we wouldn't have been able to fight the war anyway. So we would have had to stay in the British Empire.
Very, very interesting. What do you think motivated Madison to write the Constitution as it is today? Because he's often called the father of the Constitution.
Well, I wrote a whole book about Madison as constitutionalist, and one of my main reason for writing the book is that I think there are 5 or 6 major junctures in his life at which his record has generally been misunderstood, and one is what you've just said. That is, he was not the father of the Constitution. He did write what's called the Virginia Plan, which became a kind of framework for debate in the Philadelphia Convention. But about half of what's in that is not in the Constitution. In fact, Forrest McDonald, late great historian at the University of Alabama, went through the record of the Philadelphia Convention and identified 71 votes that were taken and found that Madison was on the losing side in 40 of them, 40 out of 71. And that included his favorite, what he called my favorite proposal, which was, he said, there should be a federal veto over all state laws, right? So Madison wanted several major elements that did not end up in the Constitution. This is not to say that he's not an important party in writing the Constitution. I mean, his main contribution was in actually having the Philadelphia Convention and getting George Washington to attend it. That was Madison's doing, by and large. But it's not true that he's the father of the Constitution. In fact, in his own lifetime, people called him things like that, and he would always say, "No, I'm not the father of the Constitution." One famous letter, he said, "The Constitution was the work of many heads and many hands." Right? Many heads and many hands. What did that mean? I think it meant mainly it wasn't what he wanted. So, for example, I won't belabor this point, but I'll give you one example. So when it came to the legislature, he said there should be a bicameral legislature. Both houses should be apportioned by population. The lower house should be elected by the people. The upper house should be elected by the lower house. The legislature should have a veto over all state laws. It should be able to legislate about any important question. Now, most of what I just said is not in the U.S. Constitution. So we have a bicameral legislature that the lower house is elected by the people. The rest of that is not in the U.S. Constitution. That's Madison's draft, though. So I don't think it's right to call him the father of the Constitution, and neither did he.
Okay. What do you think they thought the benefits of bicameralism were? I mean, what was the House of Representatives supposed to look like? What was the Senate really supposed to look like? How would they be different?
Well, we talked earlier about his idea that people naturally divide up into groups, parties, factions, whatever you want to call them. He used the word faction in describing it negatively, but he thought it was natural that people would end up aligning by religious organization or geographic location or some kind of affiliation. They were following some great man or particular philosophy. And if you had a monocameral legislature, then from time to time, one of those currents would come to dominate the legislature, even though it might not be dominant in society. So if you had bicameralism, that was less likely to happen. It was less likely to happen in both houses than in one. He also thought that the upper house, the Senate, should be smaller, and as a smaller body, it would tend to be dominated by people who were of a different cut than the lower house. It would be selected from the state at large, and so you'd end up only with the most prominent people, only with the people of the most achievement or the most elite backgrounds. And on the other hand, if you had far smaller districts for the lower house, then you'd end up with a more common type, right? And, you can look at our U.S. Senate and U.S. House today and see this is still kind of true. The lower house is generally a collection of, people who are prominent lawyers in their parts of upstate South Carolina or, upcountry South Carolina or northern Idaho or wherever they're from. But senators tend to be people who are far more prominent, far wealthier. And this is actually kind of what the bicameral structure was intended to give us, with the understanding that people from different parts of society, people from different demographic groups, would come to reflect the interests and preferences of different groups in society. And so that was one advantage it would have. Another advantage was that it would be far more difficult for some particular demagogue to control two houses than to control one. So, of course, we have to try to take our minds back to a time in which you only hear people you were actually looking at. And if you were in a room with a great orator, you were far more likely to be under his sway than if you weren't. So, of course, what he had in mind here were people like Patrick Henry, who was easily the most powerful politician in Virginia in this time we're talking about. And apparently his speaking was just hypnotic. Jefferson actually at one point described hearing Henry give a political speech. He said, it was like being on a raft and I was going down the river, and we've come to little bumps and eddies, and you kind of bump along, and you were totally under the spell of what he was saying. And then he said, as soon as he stopped talking, I realized I didn't agree with any of that, right? So this was a totally different kind of experience from what we're used to when we think of politicians. So partly we can understand it as intended to prevent demagoguery. Now, I'm not knocking Henry at all, but prevent great orators, for example, or people who are personally magnetic from overwhelming a legislative body, which has happened many times in history. So that was part of the reason why they wanted to have multi-cameral legislature instead of a unicameral legislature. And it kind of has worked out that way. Of course, over time, we've changed it significantly. The 17th Amendment means now, whether you're a senator or a representative, you still were elected popularly, and that's not what the original structure intended or included.
Yeah. There was a great skepticism about democracy. I mean, how do you think that played out, their skepticism of democracy?
Well, you mean how is it reflected in
the Constitution? Yes.
Okay. So back to what we were saying before about the three Jeffersonian presidents. Jefferson was far more optimistic about democracy. Madison was very skeptical about democracy. That is, he thought that it was essential that you have what he called Republican element of the federal government. There had to be an elected lower house in the legislature. You would want to give it particular powers, for example, that all spending bills and all taxing bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. But democracy in general, that was something to be worried about, because you could inflame average, and read here, ignorant or indebted people to undertake public policy initiatives that were going to be harmful in the long run. And if you had a slow working system, multi-cameral, and people having been chosen in different ways for their offices, and the president in theory was going to be chosen by an electoral college, which would probably end up being composed mainly of people like senators, right? Mainly of prominent people from their states. And so democracy was something to be worried about. It's not that you wouldn't want the common Joe to have an input in choosing the personnel for these institutions, but you wouldn't want them to be completely dominant in choosing members of these institutions as they were, say, under the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, right? Or as they were when it came to electing members of the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1787. Did that answer your question? I think it did.
Yeah, I think it answers the question. This is something that a lot of people ask about. What was their plan for the presidency? I mean, how did they come up with this system that we have, and what was their intention, and how has it changed since then? Because I don't think they didn't want the president popularly elected, but they didn't. But we essentially do have the president popularly elected nowadays. I mean,
kind of.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think? Well, at the same time, though, I don't think there was a popular vote for the president at all for a long time.
Well, different states went to popular vote at different times, and the systems were set up differently. So at the very beginning of the Jeffersonians, I tell the story of Madison's. He's been retired for years now from politics. He had been the instigator of the Jeffersonian Republican Party in the 1790s, but then he retired from the House of Representatives, and he sought election to the lower house of the Virginia legislature. And you might think, well, why would the chief author of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, why would he decide to come back into politics and do it in this low office, the lower house of the Virginia legislature? And the answer is because he wanted to change Virginia's presidential election law. So they had a system in which, in Virginia, they chose presidential electors on a congressional district basis. And what that meant in 1796 was that John Adams of Massachusetts got 2 electoral votes. Maybe it was 3 electoral votes. Anyway, he got some small number of electoral votes from Virginia, and they were enough to turn the election. So Madison came out of retirement to go into the Virginia legislature and change Virginia's electoral system so that its presidential electors would be chosen on a statewide basis. And we said before that today, I think we said before, today there are 48 states in which the presidential electors are chosen on a statewide basis. And the point of Madison doing this was to ensure that John Adams did not get any electoral votes from Virginia. And he didn't. And that ended up being the margin of Jefferson's victory in 1800 and 1801, or I should say the Republican victory in 1800 and 1801. Meanwhile, in New York, a political ally of Jefferson and Madison, Senator Aaron Burr, had succeeded in changing party control of legislative seats in the city of New York. And what that meant was that the next state legislative session was going to be the first in which the Republicans controlled the legislature. So former Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton wrote a letter to his friend, Governor John Jay, and said, Jay should call a special session of the legislature before the Republicans took control. And the legislature should decide for whom New York's presidential electors were going to be cast in the election of 1800. If Jay had done this, then John Adams would have been reelected. But Jay wrote on the back of his letter from Hamilton, quote, recommending to me a measure for party purposes, which I do not believe it would become me to adopt. So in other words, because John Jay had a higher sense of political ethics than James Madison, Burr and Jefferson won the election of 1800.
Yeah, and then it went to the House.
Yes, right. So, but the Republicans won, and the House had to choose between the Republicans. But if either Madison had had more scruples or Jay had had fewer, Adams would have been reelected.
Yeah, that was a very, very interesting election.
Yeah.
So we ended up. So, yeah, do you think they'd approve? I mean, do you think they'd approve of the system we have now? Because it's a rather convoluted system that I think.
Well, it's actually got some of the elements that they intended to get around by having electoral college. So the idea of having electoral college was the people would get to have a net input, but then it would be people who knew about politics who would actually choose the president. And the reason for doing this was because the assumption was if you lived in Georgia, you wouldn't know anything about prominent politicians in New Hampshire and vice versa. So it wouldn't make any sense for you to be voting on the merits of, again, if you're in Georgia, a politician from New Hampshire. So what you'd want to do is to identify people in Georgia and New Hampshire who would know politicians all over the country. And who would those be? Well, those would be the few prominent people, wealthy, politically connected people who knew everybody else in the colonial political elite or the new American political elite. So the idea was essentially you wouldn't end up with people like Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton and Joe Biden being elected president, because everybody in the political elite knew that there were personality problems, or in Joe Biden's case, intellectual deficits.
Oh yeah,
that would mean that those people weren't really cut out to be president. And well, we've gone away from that. We've gotten to the point where it's essentially a democratic election. We see that the way it works is high dollar advertising companies sell people on images of candidates about whom most everybody knows most nothing, and we do end up with these unfit types being elected.
And you also end up with a system. You also end up with a system that it seems to me, though, that where the focus is just on a few states, and really, it's. I'm really not a fan of the Electoral College, and I also look because it just ended up with really benefiting some of our worst presidents. Whether it be Wilson or it completely disenfranchised, and whether or not you win by a state 90-10 or win a state 51-49, it's not considered. And
the original, okay, so the people who were writing the Constitution thought of themselves as, if you were a delegate from Delaware, you were going to be thinking of the interests of Delaware. So they were living in an actually federal environment, a federal culture. And what you're saying indicates that you think of the country as one kind of homogenous entity in which the majority ought to rule. That, there's an argument to be made for that, but that's not the situation in which these people were living. They actually represented their own states in the Philadelphia Convention, and they were thinking, virtually all of them, maybe, I could name 3 or 4 who were actual nationalists, but most of them were thinking about the interests of their states. So, for example, when it came to apportionment of the U.S. Senate, James Madison repeatedly warned small state delegates, we large state delegates are just not going to accept the idea that we have an equal vote with you. Why does that make any sense? And on the other hand, people from Delaware, actually John Dickinson from Delaware, warned Madison, if you keep bringing this up, all you can do is ensure that we're not going to have any agreement, because people from small states are not going to agree to have both houses apportioned by population. You're just not going to get that. So if you keep insisting on this, you can determine that the Philadelphia Convention will produce nothing, but you're not going to get what you want. So in other words, what this is owing to is the fact that it was a federal system, and people from, in this case, Delaware, and actually Delaware was the main one that was complaining about this. So people from New Jersey were very worried about it too in the Philadelphia Convention. And so were people from Connecticut. That you're just not going to get a situation in which we say, okay, we want our state to be subsumed into some gigantic union. And of course, at the time, they didn't have any idea of a coast-to-coast country, or they would have been even more upset about the idea of just amalgamating little Connecticut and Delaware and Georgia, which in those days had essentially no population, into some big mass that was going to be run by New York and Massachusetts and Virginia. Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Well, I also wonder too if maybe it's changed that I don't think people's political interests necessarily align with just where they happen to live.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I'm actually an Army brat. So I've lived in 12 states, and I can tell you people in Connecticut and people in Idaho and people in Louisiana, which are 3 of the states I've lived in, want markedly different government. They want markedly different government. People in Idaho would like to have a libertarian society. People in Louisiana want to have prayer in school, and they want an abortion ban. People in Connecticut would like to be in Sweden. They really want, they want state provision of all kinds of goods and services. And so it's not the case that everybody would be happier if we just had one big mob, big blob, and we just had a national vote, and Louisiana and Idaho and Connecticut had to have the same government. Actually, as we've gone more and more in that direction, people have become more and more unhappy with it. And I think this is obviously inevitable. The more you centralize the system, the less Louisiana and Idaho and Connecticut can have different governments, and the less happy people in Louisiana, Idaho, and Connecticut are going to be about it. They are not happy about it. This is why people, we recently had a Supreme Court decision that said, from now on, we're no longer going to have federal courts decide abortion policy for the whole country. Now you make your own decision in your states. And we have people out marching in the streets. Oh, no, we can't be making these decisions locally. Please, Supreme Court, make these decisions for us. And I think my response to that was, why are you complaining? Like, what this means is now if you live in Connecticut or New York or California, you can subsidize abortions, which actually New York is doing. And on the other hand, it means that if you live in Idaho, you can have a kind of libertarian, non-subsidized abortion regime. And if you live in Louisiana, you can restrict abortion. Why would anybody think this was worse? People can have more of what they want.
I'm not saying I'm in favor of centralization, but I am saying, for example, most voters in the city of Austin, Texas, have more in common with the voters in San Francisco and the voters in rural California have more in common with the voters of rural Texas.
Okay. What's the solution? Where does that lead you?
Well, I'm just saying, when I do wonder if people's interests are necessarily defined by geography. Maybe they're more defined. I mean, maybe their political interests are just, you know, whatever's really important to them, and they're not necessarily defined by where they live.
Well, it happens. I've also lived in Austin.
Yeah.
I went to college and law school there,
Yeah.
and Austin is a kind of blue dot in a big red sea. And we've had political sortition and economic sortition. I think if the federal courts continue on the path they're now on of kind of resuscitating this federal model when it comes to social policy, that will be reinforced. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're right. Maybe people in Austin are just woefully unhappy with this. It seems that when I lived in Austin, it was a very liberal city. It was unlike the rest of Texas, and people in Texas think of it that way. And actually, people in Austin, you can when you get off the plane in the airport in Austin, first thing you see are people. They're selling shirts that say "Keep Austin Weird." What's weird about Austin? It's unlike the rest of Texas. That's what's weird about it.
It's not got the weirdness it used to be. But the one thing that I would ask too, though, is do you think the founding fathers, that Madison, Jefferson, and Monroe ever envisioned that the Supreme Court would basically do whatever the heck it wants?
Yeah, well, that's one theme that runs through my book is that I mentioned before, Jefferson took the oath of office from his cousin John Marshall, and then there are going to be repeated instances in which these Republicans are butting heads with John Marshall, because although the Republicans are winning all the elections, and in fact, again, by 1820, Monroe gets all but one electoral vote, and the one who votes against him is also Republican. What's going on in the Supreme Court is that Marshall is writing Hamiltonianism into constitutional law. So we end up with the situation in which Hamilton's party literally ceases to exist. It's so unpopular that there is not a single Federalist in the Electoral College in 1820. And yet Hamilton's every wish is being realized in constitutional law by John Marshall. So today, if you study con law in APUSH or as an undergraduate or in law school, you start with Marbury versus Madison, which nobody really objected to, except that Marshall introduces it by a long political lecture against Jefferson, but nobody really objected to the idea of judicial review. And then the next thing that comes is McCulloch versus Maryland, which basically says Congress can do whatever it wants. And that's where we are now. And Jefferson actually at the time lamented this. He said he thought the great flaw in the Constitution was it provided no way for the elected branches or for the people. He said, for the people to correct the judges. So we end up with a situation in which the Republicans are winning all the elections, and yet they're winning all the battles, and yet Hamilton from the grave is winning the constitutional war. And even now we have a situation in which essentially Congress can legislate about anything it likes. So that it doesn't have to tie it to the Constitution in any particular way. It just says we're spending money on this, that, and the other thing, and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's an important element of the story. Yes.
But really, that's really what Hamilton always wanted. I mean, they did not put a bank in the Constitution,
right?
But as soon as the Constitution passed, they says, "Oh, we want to have a bank,"
right?
And do you suppose that if they put the bank in the Constitution, then the Constitution would have failed? I mean, isn't that kind of at least that's my theory.
That it wouldn't have been ratified, you mean?
That if they'd put the power to charter a bank into the Constitution would not have been ratified.
Well, it's possible. Certainly people were worried about the idea that, in fact, in the Virginia Ratification Convention, people like Henry and Mason, we talked about earlier, said they thought that what they called the elastic clauses, the necessary and proper clause and the general welfare clause, that these could be teased out into empowering Congress to do whatever it wanted to do. People like Madison said, no, that's not what it means at all. It means that they can they can adopt laws that are necessary to put the enumerated powers into effect. So Marshall's court reads that the opposite way, reads that as Federalists had been telling people would not be done. And this is, it's one important part of the story in my book, that this is going on at the time. They actually tried at one point what still is the only ever impeachment of a Supreme Court justice, and he deserved to be impeached. And actually, Chief Justice Marshall testified against him in his Senate trial. He didn't intend to, but he ended up asking questions he had to answer by saying, well, yeah, my colleague was wrong about this, that, and the other thing. But the Senate then acquitted this fellow anyway, and the ground on which it acquitted him was just ridiculous. So this is the main failing at the time. I think this is the main failing at the time. I think, though, that we were talking earlier about the court's recent abortion decision. The way I understand the recent abortion decision is as a kind of resuscitation of this principle of federalism. When I first was studying these things, I really didn't have any interest in various sex-related questions that the Supreme Court takes up, but I found the federalism aspect of it just appalling, that essentially our Supreme Court was in the business from 1937 until 2020 of just ruling in whatever way the justices thought would advance their policy preferences. This is the element of the Constitution that Jefferson said he said at one point it's the great flaw in the Constitution. Another, he said it's a felo de se. In other words, essentially it's a kind of self-destruction of the Constitution, that there's no check on the judicial branch, and there really is no check if you're not going ever to impeach anybody, which we've never done, except Justice Chase, who was acquitted. So it's a sad story.
Yeah. Do you think if Jefferson and Madison could have had a crystal ball and see what's happening now, what do you think they would have done differently?
Boy.
Because I can't see how either of them would favor the country as it is now.
Oh, well, certainly Jefferson's primary political principle after republicanism, that is, after electing officials, was federalism. This idea we were talking about before, that the government was entirely decentralized, only a few functions in the central government. And in beginning in 1937, what constitutional historians call the Revolution of 1937, the Supreme Court decided we're just not going to enforce that principle. So we've come to be used to the idea, the light bulbs over my head are regulated by the federal government. The internet connection I'm talking to you on is regulated by the federal government. My car, which is sitting outside my window right now, various aspects of it are regulated by the federal government. None of these things have anything to do with the constitutional powers of the federal government. So, yeah, I think this is a foreign, the way it works now is foreign to these people. And the reason I study them is that I came over time to think, this is an attractive model they were advocating. The idea that essentially the government is going to be, with the exception of some few functions that can only be handled on a nationwide basis, essentially it's going to be decentralized, and people will make most of the political decisions they make by having political conversations with their neighbors over election to their state legislatures, which of course is the principle that the Revolution was fought for, right? Yeah. People in Connecticut didn't declare independence because they didn't want to be taxed. They declared independence because they wanted to be taxed only from Hartford, right? Yeah. Not from London. And what do we end up with? Well, nowadays they call it the swamp. Oh, and I tell stories in the book about the fact that in the day of Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, it actually was a swamp. And,
yeah, it was.
Yeah. So,
well, also, do you think they would have, supported having all these federal agencies, because it is right now, a lot of laws basically are made in the executive branch now.
Right. Which is entirely unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Again, this gets back to this Revolution of 1937, in which the court decided we're just going to let the elected branches do whatever they want, and we're going to elevate some individual rights that we haven't been worried about before. And they've been in the business of inventing individual rights since 1937. So it's operatively today, the federal constitutional system is not the one that was ratified in the late 18th century. No.
Yeah. Do you think they were necessarily opposed to do you think they were pro-capitalist and anti-socialist, or do you think they just wanted to localize socialism, which is sometimes the impression I get from some of the founding fathers, that we will have welfare programs, but we'll just make them very local.
Well, there had been welfare programs. And it always was the case that government, in some guise, took care of widows and orphans and retarded people and blind people. And, there always was going to be government provision. In Virginia, for example, which is a state I know the most about, in the colonial era, it was your local Episcopal parish. If you were in an accident and lost your leg and couldn't work anymore, it was going to find some way for you to work, and then it was going to give you a subvention to pay for your living expenses that you couldn't make up. And similarly, if you were an old lady who couldn't work and your husband died, they weren't going to leave you just to starve on the side of the road. So there always was provision for that kind of thing. On the other hand, people said they had never seen, one difference between Paris and Williamsburg was Jefferson said he never saw beggars in the street, right? There was no such thing. Yeah. So you had to go to Europe and see that. And then he thought that was appalling. And one advantage America had was it didn't have that kind of problem. So there were, of course, different economic conditions. There were different material conditions here from in Europe, but the idea that you'd be able to make a living by being on unemployment or by being on welfare was foreign.
In some respects, I think the Monroe Doctrine was kind of the beginning of this, but do you think any of them would have favored that, that the U.S. military is all over the world and that we're sticking our nose into every country's business?
This is a rhetorical question, right?
Yeah.
No, of course not. No.
Yeah.
In fact, war was to be avoided. This is one of the major differences between the Federalists and Republicans in the 1790s. The Federalists believed in keeping a peacetime military establishment in case there were some kind of foreign policy problem and you needed a defensive force. And the Republicans thought was, and Jefferson said, people in his first inaugural address, people have the idea that ours is a weak government, but actually it's the strongest one in the world because it's the only one that could count, if it were threatened on, the people to fly to the colors. So you didn't need to have any kind of military establishment at all, he thought. He insisted. And that was because if soldiers were needed, they would just show up. Of course, when the War of 1812 came, that proved to be an inaccurate prediction. But their idea was that war was a bad thing. It always meant taxes, expenditure, dead soldiers, widows and orphans. And it could mean destroyed property. There was nothing about it you shouldn't try to avoid.
Well,
and notice nowadays when our government decides to become involved in some military event, what it does is it just inflates the currency. It never says, okay, we're going to have a war. We have to raise taxes until the war's over. Why? Because they know that people wouldn't want to do that. Certainly, I don't know anybody who's saying, I want to pay taxes for the Ukrainian defensive effort, right? But they don't seem to notice when they have significant inflation of their grocery prices. So,
that's another thing too, and I think that I often wonder if Hamilton would be opposed to all the inflation we have. But I think Jefferson, Madison definitely would. But also, what about the whole, all of the cultural changes that happened? I mean, obviously, people didn't live as long back then, but you still had a culture basically where people got married, had kids, and stayed married, and men and women were different. I mean, what would they say about some of the craziness that's happening now with that? And just
it's unimagined.
Marriage is a joke now.
We can't really know because it's having a Supreme Court justice nominee testify that she can't define the word woman. People had the idea. This gets me to a constitutional provision. Of course, the Constitution requires that before becoming a Supreme Court justice, you have to take an oath of office. And in general, if you testify in Congress, you have to take an oath that what you're going to say is true. And apparently nowadays, those requirements have no weight at all. In the late 18th century, people would not lie under oath because they thought if they did, they'd go to hell. Now, people just feel free to lie about, I guess, I don't really believe that we have a Supreme Court justice who can't define the word woman. I think she just thought it would be, maybe she thought it'd be amusing, or maybe she thought it'd be politically useful to lie about it. And so this is a way in which our current culture is entirely unlike the one of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. You can't really imagine James Monroe lying under oath. I certainly can't.
Well, and they probably wouldn't imagine that we'd be going to the moon either. But I guess before we go, I guess the question is there any way to get it back, or is it just going to, or what's going to happen? Is it going to rip apart, or is it going to, or is somebody going to maybe rebuild America too on a foreign planet or something like that?
Well, I'm of course a historian. I'm not in the remedying problems business. I do think that we have woeful ignorance of history among the American population in general, and people are free to be ignorant if they want to. There's really nothing we can do about it. So we've decided we won't have any tests for the suffrage, which of course were abused in the past to exclude people on a racial basis. So now you can vote regardless whether you know anything at all, which obviously is going to have its negative effects. I'm not in the hope business, though, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, I don't know where we go from here either, but yeah, well, it's been really good talking about all this. I'll certainly, yeah, I've learned a lot from the founding fathers. I think you can still learn a lot. That started with history, and I went to that. So, and you've got 12 books, you said?
Six.
Okay, yeah. And you're at kevingutzman.com.
Yes, Gutzman, right? kevingutzman.com.
And that'll provide links like to Amazon or wherever, and we can go from there. Yeah. So.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else you want to say before we go?
That's all. I was happy to be here.
Yeah, it was great having you on here. Yeah, I'm Chris Baker. Please like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, follow the channel, buy my novel Escape from the Village, check out my Substack, and we're out. So thank you. Yeah.